I think poetry gets stigmatized. I think it gets that bad rap. We still somehow believe that 15 and 16-year-old kids in high school, their first exposure to poetry should be Shakespeare. I will be the first person to tell you that Shakespeare is a great writer. But people forget he wrote for his time. The job of the poet today is to write in the language and the idioms of this time.
This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network at blueberry.com. That's blueberry with no e's.com.
Right on America is brought to you
by a generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network,
as well as the Sims Media Foundation,
and from listeners like you.
Everyone ready? Music cue, EQ in, listen for roll cue.
Rolling on set, please. On set.
Roll tape. Jim Hart is an internationally published poet whose works have appeared in publications in the United States, Canada, England, Scotland, Austria, India, Germany, and New Zealand. Jim Hart worked for the New York City Sanitation Department in positions including Deputy Director of Public Affairs and Director of Correspondence for Sanitation Police. Hart was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and currently lives there with his wife. Jim Hart, author of Ramblings of a One-Eyed Garbage Man. Welcome to the Right on America podcast.
Thank you, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Ramblings of a One-Eyed Garbage Man. Sure is an interesting title. How'd you come up with that?
I worked for the New York City Sanitation Department for 30 years. I'm blind in one eye, and I do tend to ramble, so it just seemed like a perfect combination to form into a title.
While you were at the Sanitation Department, had you started writing?
I wrote. Prior to starting with the Sanitation Department, I had been in bands. I stayed in bands for a few years afterwards, and I wrote lyrics for songs for bands. I wrote poetry from the time I was in high school. I worked my way up from being a clerk in the garage to public affairs office, where you naturally do a lot of writing, to a director of correspondence for the Sanitation Police/Enforcement Division, where your entire job all day long is writing. It's not necessarily poetic writing. It's more answering the whys and how people got summonses and why they were arrested and things of that nature. But it does keep the brain flowing and keep the imagination going.
What made you pick poetry?
I think it is probably the best form of communication. It's direct. You have a better chance to get your flow of imagery when you're dealing in novels, which I did write a couple, and thankfully no one ever even thought to publish. You tend to get into more character development and more plot line. I think poetry gets stigmatized. I think it gets that bad rap. We still somehow believe that 15 and 16-year-old kids in high school, their first exposure to poetry should be Shakespeare. I will be the first person to tell you that Shakespeare is a great writer. But people forget he wrote for his time. His time being when the super rich were the only educated. Not only the only educated, probably the only people who could read at all. So he was writing for either people who went to very elite schools or people who were tutored privately. They had a better understanding. The job of the poet today is to write in the language and the idioms of this time. If you take that same 15 or 16-year-old high school kid and introduce him to someone's song lyrics that they like, or slam poetry that speaks, and I don't mean common in the sense of he's a common person. I mean it in the sense of the language that is commonly spoken. If you subject that person for the first time to language they understand, they will understand poetry and probably appreciate it a lot more.
Writing a novel, the writer is dealing with primary characters, their peculiarities, and how they evolve. Does the same go for poetry? Or do you have to throw out all those ideas and come in from a completely different angle?
No, you certainly want to develop a person. What happens is you develop them faster. You develop them more through imagery, but you don't tend to spend as much time as what he was wearing or necessarily what time of day he woke up. You try and get into more what he was feeling or what she was feeling or what you felt about that particular situation. And you try and do it in a more succinct manner.
What is the principal message you want to send to your readers?
My heroes were Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, Brodigan, people like that. More today would be William Logan, Cusa, Billy Collins. Those are poets that trespass on my soul. If I can't reach that great level of trespassing on someone's soul, I at least want to bump into it.
What a wonderful way to put it. Do you have a preference for first or third point of view? And does it even apply to poetry?
It applies to poetry. Certainly there are poets who write in the same language as everyone else, and first person, second. There are poets who write as any novelist would. My particular preference is to have no preference. In my book, there are 3 totally different sections. It's ramblings, which tend to be a little longer pieces. Then it's free, and that's free verse, which tends to be more of the beat poet kind of scattered throughout the page, but almost as if you diagrammed a sentence and the word you want to mean the most falls under the word of the previous line, that kind of thing. And last is bursts, which are very short poems. I wanted to show that you can write in all forms, and poetry can be good in all forms. It's not necessarily constricted, nor should it be by any time. The beats of the 1950s, every one of them wrote this way. That's simply not true. Any poet in any time should be able to write in any form.
What do you like best about being a poet, and what do you like least?
The same 2 things. The hardest part about being a writer is getting up every morning and facing the whitest piece of paper in the world. And that's also the most beautiful part, because that paper represents, on the one hand, the hard work that's going to lay ahead of you, but on the other hand, the beauty of creativity if you do it well.
You mentioned before that you like to stay free with your thinking, so you're not a plotter, and the words just come out freely as you think them?
Most of my poems tend to flow out. The ones that you plot certainly take a lot longer, certainly take a lot more out of you, to be honest. Sometimes they are your better poems. You should try and realize that and write more to that end if that's the case. I tend to read a lot of poetry, which I think if you want to write poetry, that's the number one thing you should do. If I go to a coffee shop or if I ride the subway train, I listen for fragments of people's speeches, because in them you can find a gem. You know, it's not what they said in the total sentence. These little catch things that you can grab onto and relate that to something in your life. That something becomes a poem, believe it or not.
One takeaway piece of advice for authors, what would it be?
You have to work every day. I know that's oversimplified, but that's what it is. You can't say I'm an author and write on Monday and then next Saturday pick up the pen again and expect to be in the same place, either point of view of writing or mentally. You have to sit down every day. It is a job. It is an art, but it is also a job. My advice, you have to work at it every day.
Character development in poetry, easy or difficult?
I think most poetry, whether one cares to admit it or not, starts out on a personal level. So you may write a poem, hopefully and thankfully, people will say to you, I relate to that. But you wrote it based on someone they don't know. They will never know the exact instances about what you wrote about, although they're relating to them because in their head they're transposing them into their set of circumstances. That's good writing. But you didn't start out to write about Joe's Aunt Jane. You were writing about your Aunt Kay or your mother. Joe said, hey, that's what happened to my Aunt Kay. This guy is great. You're never as great as people think you are or as bad as people think you are. You wrote about something personal, or that line you stole from somebody on the Sea Beach train in Brooklyn, and it turned into something other people can relate to. But the end product is not always the same end product the author had in mind.
What's the best advice anybody ever gave you?
A friend of mine, we started out in sanitation together. He was much smarter than I am and went on to become a professor. He was taking a poetry course, and he asked me to go sit in. The professor said, "Jim, did you write anything?" They had an exercise on the board. He shouted out, "Give me nouns, give me pronouns, give me this." And everybody shouted out words. And the professor said, "Okay, now write a poem using every word up here." Well, of course, it was impossible to use every word up there. First of all, I didn't know what half the words meant, but I had written something. He said, "This is very good." And some student commented, "I think he stole 2 of those words." Of course I did. They were the words from the Bible. But the professor said, there are only so many words in the English language. Everybody steals. It's how you arrange them after you steal them that counts. That to me is great advice. There is a thing called poetic license. For the most part, you're not making up words. You're taking words and you're arranging them. How you arrange them is what counts.
Tell me more about Ramblings of a One-Eyed Garbage Man.
It is a collection of my work over a period of years, non-themed collection, naturally personal, as I've described. Poetry, to me, is a personal experience. I hope it connects with readers in that people say, "Yeah, I get that." That, to me, is a great line. I would rather have you hate what I wrote, despise what I wrote, than say, "Oh, that was okay." Because to me, apathy is the death of writing.
How about an excerpt from the book?
It's called Family Tree. She polished daily the flight list from living room butterfly table, from 1936 wedding year until her 80-year-old death. As religiously as her Sunday Catholic communion, she pledged her mahogany sheen, removing lamp and doily and occasionally husband-left book, humming happily in joyous chore well done, shining sight of first thing seen through doorway, reflected off dark green leather chair and in pride of mother's eyes, removed now to my 2 doors down dining room corner place of honor, rubbed not with her vigor, but with the tender, wistful feeling that it is a sacred wood, carved from the outstretched branches of her love.
Where can listeners find out more about you and buy your book?
At either Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
On being a poet, wrap it up for me.
The end product of joy. People have written some very nice 5-star reviews on Amazon. While the only description of the writer is a short blurb on the back that focuses on his professional career, the poems inside serve as the biography for Jim Hart, delving through his memories of childhood and his experiences in pre-Giuliani New York City. You get to know the author as if you were sitting on a sweltering Brooklyn stoop on a dog day afternoon with him, is what you want readers to feel, as if they're sitting next to you on a stoop or in that coffee shop or on that train. They're just talking to you as if they've known you all your life. That, to me, is a perfect description of what a writer should strive for.
How does that make you feel?
That's the joy of being a writer. People saying, "I get it," is the applause I used to get at the end of a song. Somebody reads it and says, "Wow, I get that." That's joy. Beethoven's Fifth going off in your head.
Jim Hart, author of Ramblings of a One-Eyed Garbage Man, thank you for being with us on the Right on America podcast. I know our listeners will enjoy your work and your interview.
Thank you for joining us for another edition of Right on America.
Located on the internet at www.rightonamerica.us.
Additional funding courtesy the Sims Media Network. Join us again for another edition of Right on America. Once in a lifetime, the theme music for Right on America, written and sung by Stephen Paul, courtesy the Built on Dreams Media Network. Copyright Stephen Paul. All rights reserved. Used by permission.
Please email us with any questions or comments to rightonamericagroup@gmail.com. Once again, the email address is rightonamericagroup@gmail.com.